$25 billion. That's how much New York City has spent to try and tackle homelessness over the last decade. It's just an incredible amount of money. Makes you think, like, what if they had taken a different approach?
Yeah, when you see numbers like that, you can't help but wonder about the impact. Like what could have been accomplished with all that funding?
I mean, imagine if they had just used that money to build housing. Let's say a two-bedroom apartment, something like 800 square feet, costs around $250,000 to build. With $25 billion, you could build something like 100,000 apartments.
That's enough to house 250,000 people, potentially even more.
No.
Like that could have been a real game changer for so many individuals and families.
It really could have. But the thing is, that's not what happened. The data seems to show that most of that money didn't go towards actually building new housing on a large scale.
All right, and that's where things get really interesting because there are all these other approaches that try to address homelessness. Programs and services and collaborations with different organizations. And on the surface, they all seem well-intentioned.
But the data suggests that some of these approaches, they might have actually created a system where the incentives don't really align with the goal of ending homelessness.
Exactly. Like sometimes it seems like the focus shifts away from getting people into permanent housing and more towards, I don't know, maintaining the status quo.
Yeah, and there's this idea of a sort of wealth transfer. Like some people argue that a lot of that money ended up in the hands of private developers or certain nonprofits instead of directly benefiting the people who actually need help.
It definitely raises questions about accountability, right?
Right.
Like, how do we measure success when it comes to tackling homelessness? Or are we just looking at how many people are in shelters? Or are we actually focused on moving people into stable, long-term housing?
It's such a complex issue. And to really see how this plays out in real life, let's look at a specific example. Greenwood Heights in Brooklyn.
The situation in Greenwood Heights is really striking. Shelter residents make up something like 15 to 20% of the population there. That's way higher than the city average, which is like 1.37%. It's a huge difference.
And it's not like there's just one or two shelters there. We're talking about a high concentration of shelters in a really small area, like at least 4 shelters within 3 blocks and 9 within 7 blocks of one proposed site.
Yeah, and it's even more complicated because Community District 7, which includes Greenwood Heights, already has one of the highest densities of traditional shelters in all of Brooklyn. But the burden isn't evenly distributed.
Exactly. It seems like Greenwood Heights is carrying a much heavier load compared to other neighborhoods in the area, and that kind of throws a wrench in the whole not in my backyard argument, doesn't it?
It really does. It seems like the residents of Greenwood Heights aren't necessarily against shelters in general. They're more concerned about the fairness of having so many shelters concentrated in their neighborhood.
And that raises the question, who is making these decisions about where to locate shelters?
Yeah.
And what criteria are they using? The focus has to shift to the people in charge, the elected officials, the city agencies, the mayor, the council members, the people making these policies.
Right, because at the end of the day, people in Greenwood Heights and all across the city deserve genuine solutions, not just Band-Aids. They deserve equitable treatment and fair distribution of resources.
It's just crazy to think about. $25 billion spent, and they could have built 100,000 apartments with that money. But instead, you have communities like Greenwood Heights bearing a disproportionate burden.
It really makes you think, what fundamental shifts need to happen to effectively address homelessness in New York City? What needs to change in the way we approach this issue to ensure that everyone has access to safe, stable housing? And how do we ensure that resources are distributed fairly across all neighborhoods? It's a question that demands a serious answer.
No doubt about it. It's definitely something worth thinking about.